1845, Tennessee, a grand mansion, 12 powerful men, judges, colonels, bankers, meeting in secret. And in the corner, a 21-year-old enslaved girl with different colored eyes and a dangerous gift. She remembered everything, every crime, every name, every date. For 15 years, she watched in silence, but one day she spoke, and when she did, an entire county's history changed forever. This is Eliza's story, a woman with no money, no power, no rights, but an unforgettable memory. Watch till the end to discover what happened after her death that made her immortal. Let's begin. 1830.
The winter of 1824 came to Robertson County, Tennessee, with a particular cruelty that old-timers would speak of for decades to come. The frost crept across the land like an invading army, turning the rich black soil hard as iron and coating every branch, every blade of grass, every surface with a crystalline sheet of ice that caught the pale sunlight and threw it back in blinding fragments. It was the kind of cold that settled into bones and stayed there, the kind that made even the strongest men hurry through their outdoor tasks and seek the warmth of fires that never seemed quite hot enough. On the Harwell plantation, situated on 800 acres of what would normally be some of the most fertile bottomland in all of Middle Tennessee, the enslaved community huddled in their quarters, doing what they could to survive another brutal night. The cabins, hastily constructed from rough-hewn logs and chinked with mud that had long since cracked and fallen away in places, offered only minimal protection from the elements. Families pressed together for warmth, sharing threadbare blankets and body heat, while the wind howled through the gaps in the walls like a living thing searching for a way inside. Behind the grand Harwell mansion, a stately two-story structure of whitewashed brick with tall columns that spoke of wealth and southern gentility, there stood a particular cabin that was smaller than most. It had been built hastily the previous summer when Colonel James Harwell had purchased Sarah and her husband Thomas from a failing plantation in North Carolina. The cabin's single room measured perhaps 12 feet by 14, with a dirt floor that turned to mud when it rained, and a fireplace that drew poorly, filling the space with as much smoke as warmth. On this particular March morning, just as the first gray light of dawn began to seep across the eastern horizon, that small cabin became the setting for an event that would echo through Tennessee history in ways no one present could possibly imagine. Sarah, heavily pregnant and racked with labor pains that had begun sometime in the deep hours of night, lay on a straw mattress while her husband Thomas paced the small confines of their home, his face tight with worry and his hands clenched into fists of helpless frustration. Ruth, the plantation's midwife, had been summoned in the night. At 70 years old, Ruth had brought more babies into the world than she could count, certainly more than 200, perhaps as many as 300. She had seen twins and breech births, babies born too early and babies who seemed reluctant to be born at all. She had witnessed the full spectrum of human birth in all its messy, miraculous, and sometimes tragic reality. But nothing in those 70 years had prepared Ruth for the moment when Sarah's baby finally emerged into the world, slick and red and wailing, and Ruth wiped the birth matter from the infant's face and saw the child open her eyes for the first time. Ruth's hands, which had remained steady through countless difficult deliveries, began to tremble. The baby girl's left eye was the color of river water under winter light, a pale, almost ghostly blue that seemed to catch and reflect the dim firelight in an unsettling way. The right eye was brown, deep and rich as freshly turned earth after spring planting. Ruth had heard stories, of course, tales passed down through generations about children born with eyes of different colors. In the whispered folklore of enslaved communities, in the superstitions carried across the ocean from Africa and mixed with Native American beliefs and European folk magic, such eyes were considered a mark of the supernatural. "Lord have mercy," Ruth whispered, her voice barely audible over the baby's healthy cries. "Lord have mercy on this child." Sarah, exhausted from hours of labor, her body drained and aching, heard the fear in Ruth's voice and struggled to sit up. "What is it?" she asked, her own voice hoarse. "What's wrong with my baby? Give her to me. Ruth, give her to me now." Thomas moved to his wife's side, his face etched with concern. Ruth, her hands still shaking slightly, carefully wrapped the newborn in a clean piece of cloth, one of Sarah's few possessions, a scrap of fabric she had been saving for exactly this purpose, and placed the baby in her mother's arms. Sarah looked down at her daughter's face, and she saw immediately what had caused Ruth's reaction. The baby's eyes, still unfocused with newness, were indeed two different colors. But as Sarah gazed at her child, feeling the warm weight of this new life against her chest, hearing the strong, healthy cries that spoke of lungs and heart working exactly as they should, she felt no fear. Instead, she felt a fierce surge of protective love so powerful it took her breath away. "She's perfect," Sarah said firmly, looking first at Ruth and then at Thomas. "She's perfect, and she's mine, and she's a gift from God." Thomas reached out with one large, work-calloused hand and gently touched the daughter's tiny fist. The baby's fingers, impossibly small and delicate, wrapped around his thumb with surprising strength. "She is perfect," he agreed, his voice thick with emotion. "What will we name her?" Sarah had been thinking about names for months, ever since she had first felt the flutter of life within her womb. She had considered her grandmother's name, her mother's name, names of women she had known who had shown strength and dignity in the face of unimaginable hardship. But now, looking at her daughter's unique face, a different name came to her lips. "Eliza," Sarah said. "Her name is Eliza." The name had belonged to a woman Sarah had known briefly in North Carolina, a woman who had been sold away before Sarah herself was purchased by Colonel Harwell. That Eliza had been a woman of quiet strength, someone who had maintained her dignity and her sense of self even in bondage. It seemed a fitting name, a name that carried hope for strength and resilience. Ruth began to clean up from the birth, gathering the soiled cloths and preparing to dispose of the afterbirth. But she paused before leaving and turned back to Sarah with an expression that mixed concern with something that might be pity. "You need to know," Ruth said slowly, choosing her words carefully, "that folks around here, they're going to talk. They're going to say things about this child, about her eyes." She hesitated, then continued. "They call eyes like that witch eyes. Say a child born with two different colored eyes can see things others can't, see spirits, see the future, see into people's souls. Some say it's a blessing, but most say it's something to fear." Sarah's arms tightened protectively around Eliza. "I don't care what people say. I don't care what they call her eyes. She's my daughter, and she's blessed, not cursed." But even as Sarah spoke these defiant words, she understood the weight of what Ruth was telling her. In a world where enslaved people had almost no control over their own lives, where their very bodies did not belong to them, being marked as different could be dangerous. Being seen as strange or supernatural could make Eliza a target for fear, suspicion, or worse. Thomas understood this too. He looked at his wife and his newborn daughter, and his face hardened with determination. "We'll protect her," he said. "Whatever it takes, we'll keep her safe." Ruth nodded slowly. "I'll do what I can," she promised. "I won't speak of it unless someone asks direct, but word will get out. Word always does. By sunset, every soul on this plantation will know about the baby born with witch eyes." Ruth's prediction proved accurate. By the time the sun had climbed to its noon position, casting weak winter light across the frozen fields, everyone on the Harwell plantation had heard about Sarah's baby. The whispers spread through the quarters like wildfire, growing and changing with each retelling. Some said the baby had eyes that glowed in the dark. Others claimed the child had been born at the exact stroke of midnight, which everyone knew was a time when the veil between worlds grew thin. A few swore they had heard strange sounds coming from Sarah's cabin during the birth, like many voices speaking in languages no one could understand. Martha, the head housekeeper, who managed the domestic enslaved workers in the main house, was the first to visit Sarah's cabin.
Martha was a woman of indeterminate age. She might have been 40 or she might have been 60, her face lined with years of hard work and harder wisdom. She had been on the Hartwell plantation longer than anyone else, purchased by Colonel Hartwell's father back when the plantation was first being established. If there was anyone who understood how to survive in this place, how to navigate the dangerous waters of plantation life, it was Martha. She arrived at Sarah's cabin carrying a small basket containing eggs, a piece of salt pork, and some cornmeal, precious foodstuffs that she had managed to set aside from the main house kitchen. It was an act of kindness that could have gotten her punished if discovered, but Martha had her ways of moving goods without being noticed. "May I see her?" Martha asked, after the initial greetings and inquiries about Sarah's health. Sarah pulled back the cloth wrapping to reveal Eliza's sleeping face. Martha leaned in close, studying the baby's features in the dim light filtering through the cabin's single small window. When Eliza's eyes fluttered open briefly, Martha drew in a sharp breath. "Well," Martha said, after a long moment of silence, "I see why people are talking." "Are they saying terrible things?" Sarah asked, although she already knew the answer. Martha settled herself on a rough wooden stool near the bed. "They're saying all manner of foolishness, child, but let me tell you what I know, what I learned from my grandmother who learned from her grandmother before her back in the old country across the water. Eyes like these, they're rare, but they're not evil. They're not a curse. My grandmother said that a child born with two different colored eyes is a child who can see truth, not spirits or ghosts or the future, nothing supernatural like that, but truth. The truth that others try to hide, the truth that powerful folks don't want known."
The summer of 1830 arrived in Robertson County with a vengeance that seemed almost biblical in its intensity. By late June, the sun had baked the normally fertile bottomland into something resembling pottery, hard and cracked and utterly hostile to cultivation. The tobacco plants that should have been flourishing in the rich soil instead stood stunted and yellowing, their leaves curling inward as if trying to escape the relentless heat. The river that normally ran deep and strong through the county had receded to a fraction of its usual width, exposing rocks and muddy banks that hadn't seen daylight in living memory. For the enslaved community on the Hartwell plantation, the drought meant longer hours in the fields, desperately trying to save what crops could be saved, hauling water from the diminished river in an endless procession of buckets and barrels, and doing it all while the sun beat down like a hammer on an anvil. Men collapsed from heat exhaustion and were dragged to whatever shade could be found, given a drink of water, and then expected to return to work as soon as they could stand again. Women worked alongside men, their bodies just as pushed to the breaking point, with the added burden of trying to keep children fed and safe in conditions that seemed designed to kill. Eliza, who had turned 6 in March, was considered old enough to begin earning her keep. Sarah had tried to delay this moment as long as possible, knowing that once Eliza entered the world of plantation labor, childhood, such as it was for an enslaved child, would be over. But Colonel Hartwell's overseer, a man named Pike, who had a reputation for cruelty that extended well beyond the boundaries of the plantation, had made it clear that every able body was needed, and that included children who could walk and follow instructions. For most children in Eliza's position, this would have meant field work, picking tobacco worms off plants, pulling weeds, hauling water, doing the countless small tasks that even young children could accomplish. But Mrs. Hartwell had other ideas. Despite her earlier revulsion at Eliza's unusual eyes, or perhaps because of some calculation that Sarah couldn't quite figure out, Mrs. Hartwell had requested that Eliza be brought into the main house to help with domestic work. "Better she learns housework than field work," Mrs. Hartwell had said to her husband over breakfast one morning, her voice carrying through the open windows to where Sarah was working in the kitchen garden. "She's small and she's quiet. Martha says the girl is uncommonly smart for a pickaninny. We can train her up proper, and in a few years she might actually be useful."
And so, on a sweltering morning in late June, Sarah walked with Eliza from their cabin to the back entrance of the main house, a journey of perhaps 200 yards that felt like crossing into another world entirely. Sarah's hand gripped her daughter's tightly, and she leaned down to whisper last-minute instructions and warnings. "You remember everything I taught you, baby. You keep your eyes down unless someone tells you to look up. You don't speak unless you're spoken to. You move quiet and quick. If the mistress gets angry, you don't talk back, you don't make excuses, you just say, 'Yes, ma'am,' and do better. You understand?" Eliza nodded, her unusual eyes wide with a mixture of fear and curiosity. She had seen the main house from a distance her entire life. It loomed over the plantation like a monument to power and wealth. Now, as Sarah led her through the back door and into the kitchen, Eliza's senses were overwhelmed by 100 new impressions all at once. The kitchen was massive compared to the cabin where Eliza lived. It had a high ceiling with exposed beams, whitewashed walls, an enormous fireplace with multiple cooking stations, and more pots, pans, and cooking implements than Eliza had known existed in the world. The heat was intense. The fire had been burning since before dawn to prepare the family's breakfast, and the air was thick with smells of baking bread, cooking meat, and herbs hanging in bundles from the ceiling. Martha was waiting for them, standing near a large wooden table where she had been kneading dough. She wiped her hands on her apron and looked at Eliza with an expression that was kind but serious. "This is it, then," Martha said to Sarah. "Don't worry, I'll look after her as best I can." Sarah hugged Eliza tightly, fighting back tears. "You be good, you be smart, and you come home to me every night, you hear?" "Yes, Mama," Eliza whispered back, her voice small. After Sarah left, Martha spent the rest of that first day teaching Eliza the basics of working in the main house. The lessons came rapid fire, a torrent of information that would have overwhelmed most 6-year-old children. But Eliza absorbed it all with that remarkable memory of hers, filing away every instruction, every warning, every detail of this new world she had entered. "The mistress likes her floors clean enough to eat off of, though God knows why she'd want to eat off a floor," Martha explained as she demonstrated how to scrub the kitchen's wide plank flooring. "You scrub with the grain of the wood, not against it. You get down on your hands and knees, and you work from one corner to the other. Don't miss any spots because she will notice, and she will make you do it again. When you're carrying things, plates, glasses, anything, you walk slow and steady. No running, no rushing, even if someone tells you to hurry. Better to be a little slow than to break something valuable. You break something, you'll feel the switch for sure. The master and mistress have dinner parties, lots of them. Important men come here to talk business. When they're talking, you're invisible. You hear me? Invisible. You don't look at them, you don't react to anything they say, you just do your work, and you might as well be a piece of furniture for all the attention you should draw." This last instruction would prove to be the most important lesson Eliza ever learned, though neither of them could have known it at the time. The Harwell household was run with the precision of a military operation, and Mrs. Harwell was the general who demanded absolute obedience and perfection. She was a woman who had been raised in Charleston society and married Colonel Harwell when she was just 18 years old. 20 years later, she ruled her domestic domain with an iron will and a sharp tongue that could cut deeper than any whip. Mrs. Harwell had certain expectations about how her house should be run, and she enforced these expectations through a system of inspections, punishments, and rewards that kept the enslaved household workers in a constant state of anxiety. Every morning at precisely 6 o'clock, she would conduct a walkthrough of the main rooms, running her fingers along windowsills, checking for dust, examining floors for scuff marks, inspecting furniture for any sign of neglect. Woe to the worker who failed her inspection. For Eliza, those first few weeks in the main house were terrifying. She was the youngest of the household workers, and her unusual eyes made her a target for Mrs. Harwell's particular attention. The mistress seemed to take a perverse pleasure in finding fault with Eliza's work, no matter how carefully it was done.
"Those eyes," Mrs. Hartwell would say, her voice dripping with distaste, "tell her to keep those witch eyes pointed at the floor where they belong." Martha did her best to shield Eliza from the worst of Mrs. Hartwell's cruelty, teaching her tricks for staying out of sight and completing tasks to an impossibly high standard. But there were some things even Martha couldn't protect her from. Twice in the first month, Eliza felt the bite of the switch across her back for infractions so minor she couldn't even understand what she had done wrong. She learned to accept pain in silence, to show no reaction, to simply say, "Yes, ma'am," and do better. But despite the fear and the pain, Eliza began to excel at her work in ways that even Martha surprised. Her remarkable memory meant that she only needed to be shown how to do something once before she could replicate it perfectly. She learned the layout of the house with such precision that she could navigate it in the dark. She memorized the family's routines, their preferences, their moods, and she learned to anticipate needs before they were spoken. More importantly, she learned to be invisible in exactly the way Martha had taught her. When important visitors came to dine, Eliza would move through the rooms like a shadow, filling water glasses, clearing plates, bringing fresh courses from the kitchen, all while seeming to be barely present at all. The men who gathered around the Hartwell dining room would talk freely in her presence, never imagining that the small girl with the witch eyes was listening to every word they said and remembering it all with perfect clarity. Colonel James Hartwell was 45 years old in the summer of 1830, a man at the height of his power and influence. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and a commanding presence that made people pay attention when he entered a room. He had thick, dark hair going silver at the temples, a carefully groomed beard, and eyes that could shift from warm and charming to cold and calculating in an instant. He dressed in expensive clothes tailored in Nashville, rode a magnificent black horse named Caesar, and carried himself with the confidence of a man who had never known defeat. But it wasn't just his physical presence that made Colonel Hartwell powerful. He owned the largest plantation in Robertson County, with over 80 enslaved people working his fields and house. He had investments in banks, railroads, and land speculation across Tennessee and into Kentucky. He sat on the boards of multiple companies and served as a director of the Robertson County Bank. He was a member of the state legislature, where he had made a name for himself as a powerful speaker and a shrewd political operator. Most importantly, he was the unofficial leader of what was known among those in the know as the Springfield Association, a group of 12 prominent families who controlled virtually every aspect of life in Robertson County. These families owned the largest plantations, ran the banks, controlled the court.
The Springfield Association didn't officially exist. There were no membership rolls, no written bylaws, no charter filed with any government office. If anyone outside the inner circle had asked about it directly, the 12 prominent families who formed its core would have looked puzzled and perhaps slightly offended, claiming ignorance of any such organization. They would have described themselves simply as neighbors and business associates who occasionally gathered socially, as successful men often did, to discuss matters of mutual interest over dinner and drinks. But the lack of official existence didn't make the association any less real or any less powerful. In fact, its informal nature was part of what made it so effective. Operating in the shadows, never putting anything in writing that could be traced or proven, the 12 families had constructed a web of influence and control that touched every aspect of life in Robertson County and extended well beyond its borders. By the summer of 1835, when Eliza was 11 years old, the association had been operating for more than a decade, and its members had refined their methods to a dark art. The dinners at the Hartwell plantation had become more frequent and more elaborate, occurring sometimes weekly and occasionally even more often when important business needed to be discussed. These weren't the formal society dinners that Mrs. Hartwell hosted for the county's social elite. Those were different affairs with different guests, governed by different rules of etiquette and propriety. The association meetings were something else entirely.
They typically took place on Saturday evenings after the week's business had been concluded and before the Sunday church services, where these same men would sit in the front pews and bow their heads in prayer. The meetings had a ritual quality to them, a structure that had evolved over years of practice. The men would arrive separately, spacing their arrivals to avoid drawing attention to the gathering. They would come dressed well, but not ostentatiously, on horseback or in carriages, and they would enter through different doors, some through the front entrance like honored guests, others through the side entrance near the library, still others through the garden gate and the French doors that led to Colonel Hartwell's study. Eliza, now one of the primary servers for these gatherings, had learned to recognize each of them by sight, by voice, by the particular way they moved and spoke. She knew their faces better than she knew her own reflection. After all, she rarely had occasion to look in a mirror, but she saw these men regularly and studied them with an attention born of necessity and caution. Judge Thomas Morrison, who at 58 was the oldest member of the association, always arrived first. He was a massive man, well over 250 pounds, with a face that had gone florid from years of heavy drinking. He had been a circuit court judge for 20 years and wielded his position like a club, ruling from the bench with absolute authority and a complete disregard for actual justice. His eyes were small and mean, buried in folds of flesh, and his hands, which Eliza had seen sign away people's property and livelihoods with a flourish of his pen, were surprisingly delicate, with long fingers that seemed at odds with his brutal personality. Judge Samuel Ashford usually arrived second. Where Morrison was physical intimidation personified, Ashford was smooth and sophisticated, a man of education and culture who could quote Greek philosophers and Shakespeare with equal ease. He was thin and sharp-featured, always impeccably dressed, with silver hair worn longer than was fashionable, and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He served as the county's probate judge, which gave him control over estates and inheritances, a position he had used to tremendous advantage in the association's schemes. Eliza had heard him speak of the dead with a callousness that chilled her blood, discussing how to manipulate the distribution of estates before the bodies were even cold. Marcus Blackwood, the merchant, was usually third to arrive. He was a man of average height and build who somehow managed to make himself seem larger than he was through sheer force of personality. His general store was the largest in Springfield, but that was just his most visible business. He also owned warehouses, shipping concerns, and had investments in every significant commercial venture in the county. His specialty within the association was market manipulation, using his knowledge of supply and demand to buy up goods when prices were low and then create artificial scarcity to drive prices higher. During the drought of 1830, he had made a fortune selling seed grain and food at prices that drove many families to the brink of starvation. The other members, Patterson, Reynolds, Caldwell, Williams, Tucker, Bradford, Simmons, and Hayes, each brought their own particular expertise and resources to the association. Patterson owned the largest cotton plantation in the county and controlled much of the cotton trade. Reynolds ran the Robertson County Bank and had access to financial information that gave the association tremendous advantages in their schemes. Caldwell was a lawyer who specialized in land titles and property law, making him invaluable for finding legal justifications for their thefts. Williams was a railroad investor with connections to political power in Nashville and beyond. Tucker was perhaps the most dangerous of them all, a man who nominally worked as a deputy sheriff, but who in reality served as the association's enforcer. He was the one who delivered threats to people who tried to resist. He was the one who arranged accidents for those who proved too stubborn. He was the one who made problems disappear, sometimes along with the people who had created those problems. Bradford and Simmons were both politicians, serving in the state legislature where they could influence laws and regulations to benefit the association. And Hayes was a doctor who, in addition to his medical practice, served as the county coroner, a position that gave him the power to determine cause of death in suspicious cases. a power he had used to cover up several murders over the years. Together, these 12 families formed an interlocking network of power that controlled the courts, the banks, the major businesses, the law enforcement, the medical examiner, and the political representation of Robertson County. It was a system designed to be impenetrable, and for years it had been exactly that. On a particularly hot August evening in 1835, when Eliza was 11 years old, the association had been operating for more than a decade, and its members had refined their methods to a dark art. The dinners at the Harwell plantation had become more frequent and more elaborate, occurring sometimes weekly and occasionally even more often when important business needed to be discussed. These weren't the formal society dinners that Mrs. Harwell hosted for the county's social elite. Those were different affairs, with different guests, governed by different rules of etiquette and propriety. The association meetings were something else entirely. They typically took place on Saturday evenings, after the week's business had been concluded, and before the Sunday church services, where these same men would sit in the front pews and bow their heads in prayer. The meetings had a ritual quality to them, a structure that had evolved over years of practice. The men would arrive separately, spacing their arrivals to avoid drawing attention to the gathering. They would come dressed well, but not ostentatiously, on horseback or in carriages, and they would enter through different doors, some through the front entrance like honored guests, others through the side entrance near the library, still others through the garden gate and the French doors that led to Colonel Harwell's study. Eliza, now one of the primary servers for these gatherings, had learned to recognize each of them by sight, by voice, by the particular way they moved and spoke. She knew their faces better than she knew her own reflection. After all, she rarely had occasion to look in a mirror, but she saw these men regularly and studied them with an attention born of necessity and caution. Judge Thomas Morrison, who at 58 was the oldest member of the association, always arrived first. He was a massive man, well over 250 pounds, with a face that had gone florid from years of heavy drinking. He had been a circuit court judge for 20 years and wielded his position like a club, ruling from the bench with absolute authority and a complete disregard for actual justice. His eyes were small and mean, buried in folds of flesh, and his hands, which Eliza had seen sign away people's property and livelihoods with a flourish of his pen, were surprisingly delicate, with long fingers that seemed at odds with his brutal personality. Judge Samuel Ashford usually arrived second. Where Morrison was physical intimidation personified, Ashford was smooth and sophisticated, a man of education and culture who could quote Greek philosophers and Shakespeare with equal ease. He was thin and sharp-featured, always impeccably dressed, with silver hair worn longer than was fashionable, and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He served as the county's probate judge, which gave him control over estates and inheritances, a position he had used to tremendous advantage in the association's schemes. Eliza had heard him speak of the dead with a callousness that chilled her blood, discussing how to manipulate the distribution of estates before the bodies were even cold. Marcus Blackwood, the merchant, was usually third to arrive. He was a man of average height and build, who somehow managed to make himself seem larger than he was through sheer force of personality. His general store was the largest in Springfield, but that was just his most visible business. He also owned warehouses, shipping concerns, and had investments in every significant commercial venture in the county. His specialty within the association was market manipulation, using his knowledge of supply.
The year 1845 arrived in Robertson County with a false sense of normalcy. On the surface, everything appeared prosperous and orderly. The drought years were behind them, crops were growing well, and the county seat of Springfield bustled with commerce and activity. The grand houses of the association family stood as monuments to success and respectability, their white columns gleaming in the Tennessee sun, their gardens perfectly manicured, their owners prominent in church and civic affairs. But beneath this veneer of prosperity, cracks had begun to appear in the association's carefully constructed facade.
Over 15 years of operation, the 12 families had grown bolder and more brazen in their schemes. What had started as relatively subtle manipulations had evolved into outright theft and corruption on a scale that was becoming harder to hide. Too many families had lost their properties under suspicious circumstances. Too many court cases had ended in predictable ways. Too many coincidences had strained the credulity of even the most trusting observers. In Nashville, the state capital, certain politicians and lawyers had begun asking uncomfortable questions about Robertson County. There were whispers in the legislature about corruption, about judges who couldn't be trusted, about a system that seemed rigged to benefit a small group of powerful families. But whispers weren't evidence, and the association members were skilled at deflecting suspicion and using their political connections to suppress investigations before they could gain momentum. What none of them knew was that the real threat to their empire wasn't coming from Nashville politicians or reformist lawyers. It was sitting quietly in a slave cabin on the Harwell plantation, waiting for the right moment. Eliza was 21 years old in the autumn of 1845. She had spent 15 years working in the main house, serving at countless association meetings, absorbing information like a sponge. Her remarkable memory had only grown more precise with age. She could recall conversations from years ago word for word, could remember dates and amounts and details with perfect accuracy. She had essentially compiled a complete record of the association's crimes in her mind, documented with the kind of precision that would have made a court stenographer envious. But she had never spoken of it to anyone except Martha, and those conversations had been rare and carefully guarded. Martha, now in her 80s and moving slowly with the weight of age and hard years, had continued to counsel caution and silence. "Knowledge is power," she would tell Eliza, "but only if you're in a position to use it. Right now, all that knowledge would just get you killed." The moment that would change everything came on a Thursday afternoon in late September. Eliza was working in Colonel Hartwell's study, dusting the bookshelves and organizing papers as she had done thousands of times before. The colonel was in Springfield attending some business matter. Mrs. Hartwell was visiting friends in Nashville, and the house was quiet except for the normal sounds of domestic work happening in other rooms. Eliza was reaching to dust a high shelf when her hand brushed against a leather-bound ledger that had been pushed to the back, hidden behind a row of law books. The ledger fell to the floor with a heavy thump, its pages spilling open. Eliza bent to pick it up, intending simply to return it to its hiding place, but her eyes caught on the entries written in Colonel Hartwell's distinctive handwriting. What she saw made her blood run cold. It was a complete accounting of the association's operations. Property acquisitions listed with the actual prices paid versus the fraudulent amounts claimed in court documents. Payments made to various officials for favorable treatment. Detailed notes on schemes that were planned or in progress. It was, in essence, a confession of 15 years of systematic corruption, all documented in Colonel Hartwell's own hand. Eliza's mind raced. This ledger was evidence, real, tangible evidence that could prove everything she knew. But she also understood immediately how dangerous it was. If Colonel Hartwell discovered it was missing, there would be a manhunt. Everyone in the house would be questioned, searched, possibly tortured. And even if she managed to get it off the plantation, who could she take it to? The local courts were controlled by the association members. The sheriff's office was compromised. Even bringing it to Nashville would be difficult. She was enslaved. She couldn't just leave the plantation. And if she was caught with it, she would be killed without hesitation. For long moments, Eliza stood frozen, the ledger in her hands, her mind spinning through possibilities and consequences. Then, moving with sudden decision, she carefully returned the ledger to its hiding place exactly as she had found it, making sure the dust patterns on the shelf looked undisturbed. She would not steal the evidence, not yet, but she would remember where it was, and she would read every page of it when she had the chance. Over the following weeks, Eliza found excuses to work in the Colonel's study whenever the house was empty. Page by page, she read through the entire ledger, committing its contents to her already formidable memory. What she discovered went beyond even her comprehensive knowledge of the association's crimes. The ledger contained details of schemes she hadn't heard discussed at the dinners, references to operations in other counties, notes about bribes paid to officials in Nashville, and, most damning of all, a list of people who had been removed as obstacles to the association's plans. Tom Anderson's name was on that list, along with a notation, disposed of, November 1838, ruled accidental death by Hayes. Eliza had to stop reading when she saw that entry, had to close her eyes and breathe deeply to keep from being sick. She had heard them discuss Anderson's fate back in 1835, but part of her had hoped they wouldn't actually go through with it, that it had just been talk. But no, they had killed him, just as casually as they had discussed it, and the county coroner, Dr. Hayes, had covered it up. And there were other names on the list, other accidents and unfortunate incidents that were actually murders disguised by the association's control of the legal system. As October turned to November, events began to move in ways that would finally create an opening for Eliza to act. A new circuit court judge named William Foster was appointed to serve in an adjoining county. Foster had a reputation as a reformer and a man of integrity, exactly the kind of judge that made the association nervous. But more importantly, Foster had no connections to the association and no debts to them. He was, as far as anyone could tell, truly independent. At an association meeting in early November, Eliza heard the members discuss Foster with palpable concern. "He's going to be a problem," Judge Morrison warned. "I've made some inquiries. He can't be bought, and he has support from some powerful people in Nashville. If he starts looking into our operations, then we need to make sure he has nothing to find," Colonel Hartwell said firmly. "We pull back on new operations until we understand what kind of threat he represents. We review all our existing arrangements to make sure nothing can be traced back to us, and we keep a very close eye on which cases end up in his court." But the association's careful planning was about to be disrupted by something they had never anticipated and couldn't have prevented. In mid-November, Judge Samuel Ashford suffered a stroke. It was severe, leaving him partially paralyzed and unable to speak clearly. The stroke happened in his chambers at the courthouse, witnessed by his clerk and several lawyers, so there was no way to hide it or cover it up. The implications were immediate and severe. As probate judge, Ashford had controlled the flow of estates through the court system, had managed the assignment of administrators, had manipulated the distribution of inherited property to benefit the association. But with him incapacitated, someone else would need to take over his cases, at least temporarily. And the most likely candidate, given the distribution of judicial responsibilities, was Judge Foster. Eliza learned all this not from an association meeting, but from conversations she overheard in the main house as Colonel Hartwell met urgently with other members to discuss the crisis. The panic in their voices was barely concealed. Judge Ashford had been handling dozens of estates, many of them involving properties that the association had plans for. If Foster took over those cases and actually looked at what had been happening, "We need to get the records cleaned up," Caldwell insisted, his lawyer mind already working on damage control. "Any estate where we've made irregular arrangements, we need to have explanations ready. Better yet, we need to settle those estates quickly before Foster can review them too closely." But it was already too late for that. Judge Foster, when he took over Ashford's caseload, proved to be exactly what the association feared, a man who actually read the files, who asked probing questions, who demanded documentation and justification for decisions that didn't make sense. Within 2 weeks of taking over, he had identified several estates where the handling seemed highly irregular. It was into this atmosphere of growing crisis that fate delivered the final catalyst for change. On a cold December morning, Martha collapsed while working in the kitchen. She was carried to her small room off.
Freedom was a strange thing for Eliza. For the first time in her life, she belonged to herself. But freedom came with responsibility and with fear. The association members were in prison, but their friends and supporters still lived in Robertson County. Many people considered Eliza a traitor, and some wanted her dead. Judge Foster made arrangements for Eliza's safety. He secured her a place in a Nashville boarding house where educated free women lived. The house was run by an elderly Quaker woman named Sarah Mitchell, who was active in the abolition movement. Sarah gave Eliza safe refuge and helped her begin her new life. But there was a pain in Eliza's heart that could never fully heal. Freedom had come to her alone. Her parents were still enslaved on the Hartwell plantation. Colonel Hartwell's property had been seized after his conviction, but the legal process was so lengthy that his slave's freedom had not yet been decided. Eliza lay awake at night thinking about her parents. Were they well? Were they getting enough to eat? Did the other plantation workers hate them because their daughter had exposed the association? These questions tormented her. One day, Sarah Mitchell spoke to Eliza. "What's troubling your heart, child?" Sarah asked, looking at Eliza with motherly eyes. Eliza spoke what was in her heart. Sarah listened carefully, then said, "There are people I know who can help. The abolition movement has lawyers, has connections. We might be able to secure your parents' freedom through legal means." Over the following months, Sarah used her contacts. Anti-slavery lawyers filed a petition arguing that because Colonel Hartwell's conviction, all his property, including his enslaved people, should come under court custody. And those enslaved people who had been directly affected by Hartwell's corruption should be granted freedom as compensation for years of injustice. This legal argument was novel and risky. Slavery was legal in Tennessee, and courts typically took property rights very seriously. But Judge Foster supported the case. He argued that Hartwell had used his enslaved people to commit crimes, forcing them to remain silent about the corruption. This made them victims, not simply property. In the spring of 1848, the court announced its decision. All 43 enslaved people from the Hartwell plantation were to be freed. It was an unprecedented decision, and it sent shockwaves through Tennessee. The day Eliza reunited with her parents in Nashville was the most emotional day of her life. Her mother embraced her and wept for hours. Her father, who rarely showed emotion, had tears in his eyes as he said, "You saved us all, Eliza. You gave us a future." But freedom brought new challenges. Eliza's parents needed work and a place to live. Sarah Mitchell helped again. Eliza's mother found work as a cook in a Quaker family's home, and her father found work at a stable. These were humble jobs, but for the first time in their lives, they were earning wages and working for themselves. Eliza herself was searching for her own path. Her exceptional memory and intelligence could now be a blessing rather than a curse. Sarah suggested she begin teaching in a school for freed slaves and black children. Nashville abolitionists had opened a small school for this purpose. At first, Eliza hesitated. "I'm barely educated myself," she said. "I've never attended a formal school." "But you read, you write, you understand law and numbers," Sarah replied. "And most importantly, you understand what it means to be denied education. That makes you the perfect teacher." In the fall of 1848, Eliza began teaching. Her first class had only 8 students, 6 children, and 2 adults who wanted to learn the alphabet. But Eliza's dedication and patience soon attracted more students. Eliza found strange satisfaction in teaching. Every time a student wrote their name for the first time or read their first paragraph, Eliza felt as if another chain was breaking. Education was power.
the power that Martha had given her, and now she was passing that power forward. But the past never stays buried. In 1849, Eliza learned that Tucker, the man convicted of Tom Anderson's murder, had died in prison. Natural causes, officially. But soon rumors spread that Tucker had committed suicide, unable to bear the guilt and shame. This news was complicated for Eliza. Tucker had committed terrible crimes, had killed people, but his death brought her no joy, only an empty feeling. Justice had been served, but justice couldn't bring back the victims. That same year, Eliza made another important decision. She wanted to formally join a church. Sarah Mitchell was a Quaker, but Eliza was attracted to the African Methodist Episcopal Church, a church that the black community had built for themselves, where their voices were heard. The church gave Eliza community. There were people who understood her struggles, who didn't judge her past. The pastor, Reverend James Washington, was a powerful speaker who frequently preached against slavery. He heard Eliza's story and was impressed. "Your testimony brought down the powerful, but now you must build up the powerless. God has given you a voice. Use it to speak for those who cannot speak for themselves." These words reminded her of Martha's last advice. Eliza realized her work wasn't finished. Exposing the association was only the first step. Now she had to strengthen her community, educate people, give them the tools to stand up for themselves. In 1850, events took a new turn. Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act, which made it legal to capture escaped slaves and return them to bondage, even from free states. This law created panic throughout the black community. Even free black people feared they could be enslaved through false accusations. Tension rose in Nashville. Sarah Mitchell and her Quaker friends began building underground networks to help escaped slaves. Eliza, already aware of the realities of injustice, became involved in this work. It was dangerous work. If caught, there would be heavy punishment, fines, jail, or worse. But Eliza found courage within herself. "I've confronted powerful men before. I can do this too." Eliza's role was primarily communication. Because of her exceptional memory, she could remember addresses of safe houses without writing anything down. She delivered coded messages, planned routes. Sometimes she personally hid escaped slaves in her small room at Sarah's boarding house. One incident was particularly memorable. In the winter of 1851, a young woman named Mary arrived in Nashville with her 3-year-old daughter, having escaped from slavery. Slave catchers were on their trail. Eliza hid Mary and her daughter in her room when the slave catchers came to the boarding house. Sarah Mitchell, with her Quaker dignity, stood at the door and calmly said, "There are no fugitives here. This is a house of God-fearing people who follow their conscience." The slave catchers made threats, but Sarah didn't flinch. Eventually, unable to prove anything legally, they left. 3 days later, Eliza sent Mary and her daughter to the next safe house on their journey to Canada. As Mary was leaving, she said to Eliza, "You risked everything for us. We're strangers to you." Eliza replied, "No one is a stranger who suffers. I know what it means to be powerless. If I can use my freedom to help others gain theirs, then my freedom means something." Alongside teaching and Underground Railroad work, Eliza began another project. She wanted to write her testimony, not just about the association, but about the reality of slavery. She wanted people to know what this institution did to human beings. Sarah encouraged her, "Your story needs to be told. People in the North read about slavery, but they don't understand it. Your words can change minds." At night, by candlelight, Eliza wrote. Slowly, carefully, she transferred her memories to paper. Martha's teachings, the association meetings, the trial experience, the first feeling of freedom, everything. It was a painful process, reliving each memory, but she knew it was necessary. In 1852, Eliza's memoir was published, Chains of Memory, a testimony against slavery. It was printed by a local abolitionist press. It didn't become a bestseller, but it had impact. Abolition societies distributed copies, newspapers printed excerpts, people quoted it in speeches. Eliza's life was now filled with purpose. During the day, she taught. In the evening, she worked for the Underground Railroad. At night, she wrote and spoke at events. She was exhausted, but also fulfilled. But life is only not work. In 1853, Eliza met Samuel Roberts, a free black man who worked as a carpenter in Nashville. Samuel came to a church function where Eliza was speaking. His quiet intelligence and gentle nature attracted Eliza. Gradually, they got to know each other. Samuel admired Eliza's courage and commitment. Eliza found comfort in Samuel's steadiness and kindness. For the first time, Eliza considered the possibility of romance, a possibility she could never have imagined in her past circumstances. In the spring of 1854, Samuel proposed. It was simple and honest. "I can't offer you luxury or comfort," he said, "but I can offer you respect, partnership, and lifelong companionship." Eliza said yes. Their wedding was held in the church.
That was the story of Eliza, a woman who broke the chains of slavery and became a beacon of hope. If her courage inspired you, please like and share this video. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Which part of her life moved you most? And which historical hero should I cover next? If you haven't yet, subscribe and hit the bell icon for more powerful stories. Remember, history is built on the courage of those who dared to change the world. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.